Skokie. That was him. Good evening, everyone. Good to see you on this beautiful day. Norm and I were driving in, and we looked west, and we saw the most beautiful sunset. Yeah, some people. Oh man, it was too. Anyways, I hope somebody got a picture of that. That's one of those that goes in some book someplace because it was really cool. Nita handed this to me. There is a drama presentation this evening. And so if your child or grandchild or prayer pal is in the first or second grade, that's the Leopards, then you need to attend that presentation immediately at 7:45. So try not to forget that. All right, we're in the book of Haggai tonight. I told Norma earlier as I was working on this, she says, are you about done? I've worked on it for several days now and everything. And I said, this is the most frustrated I've ever been putting a lesson together. Haggai is the simplest of the minor prophets, literally the simplest. And I've been having trouble putting together what I want on PowerPoint and what I want to say. And then I realized next week is Zechariah. Oh my goodness, that's a complicated one. So I may be sick next week, and Roy may be filling in for me or something. I'm not real sure. Anyway, just one of those days. All right, book of Haggai. Haggai is one of the shortest books of the prophets, and as I said earlier, probably the easiest to understand. If you read it, it's not very complicated. There's not a lot of things in it. You say, well, gee, I wonder what he's talking about. It's pretty easy to understand what he's talking about. His main mind, the mind of Haggai, is really one thing, and that is build that temple. If you remember, the first temple was torn down and destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians in 586, and as I understand, most, if not all, of the Jewish people in Judah then were hauled off to Babylon captive. Some were not, but most of them were. And so we find that Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi is the last prophet listed in the Bible. Those three prophesied after the return from Babylon, after folks came back and were trying to rebuild the city, trying to rebuild the temple and all that. So those are our last three. As I told you earlier, I'm kind of trying to keep things in chronological order. And so they will have similar themes, those three. And of course then Malachi ends it before there's a 400-year period of time before we hear about the Messiah and the Gospels are written. Now, Daniel and Ezekiel prophesied during the exile to Babylon. So, I don't want to get confused. We don't study those in this class because those are not minor prophets. But those guys prophesied during the time in Babylon of the Jewish people. So about 16 years before these three began to prophesy, the first group of exiles came back from Babylon. And that was about 536 BC. And King Cyrus allowed Zerubbabel to lead about 50,000 of the Jewish people back to the homeland. Again, that was about 536 BC. They began to rebuild the temple, but they were a bit discouraged, and they didn't get much done. Guys in the booth, not working here. Let me see. Clicky, clicky. Okay. There you go. Thank you. Got it. So about 16 years before these three started prophesying, that's when that first group of about 50,000 came back. They began to rebuild the temple, but they got discouraged and they quit. Obviously not an easy task. And so when they had found the foundation laid and they got some of that done, they abandoned it until Haggai and Zechariah came along. And so that's kind of where we are in this study of Haggai. All right, so let's build some historical context here. Always like to put some history in. There may be more history in this one than normal, simply because the book isn't very long. Okay, so I get to share some. And this is kind of a key area. They're not just off prophesying someplace. This is a special thing. God, working through King Cyrus and other kings in Persia, allowed folks to come back and rebuild the city, rebuild the temple, and kind of get back on track again. And this is the last time. It doesn't happen again. And so the very first Persian empire, or Achaemenid, how do you say that? Achaemenid. I think that's correct. Achaemenid Empire. But we're going to call it the Persian Empire because that's really what it was founded by Cyrus the Great in 550. He's the one that let Zerubbabel first come back with about 50,000 folks. He conquered the Babylon Empire. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was king of the Babylon Empire when they first went in and took Judah and all the folks into captivity. That was the Babylonian Empire. There were a couple of other kings after him, but he's noted for that and still very famous in that area today. He's still really a hero of that part of the country today. But Cyrus came in and conquered them. Now we call it now the Persian Empire rather than the Babylonian Empire, and it became the world's first what we would call superpower in history. It stretched from Europe to Africa to India. And Persian Empire was a little different than some of the other empires. Cyrus and others were very willing to let the captives, and not just Judah, captives of other nations as well, very willing to let them go home, rebuild their temples, and worship as they would. It's almost like, are you serious? Nobody else does this. Everybody else considers the captives to be nothing and punish them, make them work hard, or steal everything from them or whatever. Well, the Persian Empire at this time at least was a little bit different than that, and they allowed people to go home. So folks got to go home besides just the Jews at that time. It was a hub of culture, religion, science, art, technology for over 200 years. If you hear anybody say or you read anything about folks talking about the people in the area of Iran or the Middle East were very much advanced over many or most civilizations via science and art and things like that, they really were. It was really a great time as far as the exploration of those things and coming out with a lot of the things that they did. It really was a good time for them. But in 330, Alexander the Great came along. He was Macedonian, and he came along and conquered the Persian Empire. And so, not unusual, we go from Babylon to Persia, to Alexander the Great conquering them. But we still see a line of authority coming from, I'm going to go ahead and say it, the Persian Empire, and the long line that still comes from a lot of them. We still see that in a lot of different places. Now, nearly, at least that I know of, nearly every nation, empire, whatever, still had some kind of religion that they followed or whatever. Zoroastrianism was established or invented by Zoroaster, a man, Zoroaster, and it became the primary religion of the Persian Empire during the reign of Cyrus, and it was really a big deal. Ahura Mazda was the lead god, or that overwhelming entity out there that created everything. And so I won't talk about this, but it's interesting to note that most nations if you read their history and kind of dig back into it, you realize that so many religions and things things that these folks worship had some connection to reality. Now they were not reality in themselves, but they had some connection to it. Zoroastrianism taught truth and being good. It was kind of a works-based religion. It did believe in the afterlife. Where did they get that? I have a philosophy that may be right or wrong, but I think it came from the very beginning. People knew who God was all the way up and until people were corrupt and in Noah's time, and God got rid of them and then moved on. They didn't have a law, they didn't have temples, they didn't have a worship to do, but people knew there was a God. And probably most people had heard ancestors tell them stories about God, stories about the flood, stories about this and that, and so they built their own religions around some of those. I can't explain that properly. I'm not smart enough, don't know enough to do that, but there is a lot of connection with a lot of the ancient religions that we see have some particles of those religions that are connected to reality. But anyway, so Zoroastrianism went away with the Persian Empire later when the Islamic Revolution took place. And Islam was instituted into that area, and most of those who were practicing Zoroastrianism moved, and a lot of them went to India. Zoroastrianism is still alive in India and parts of Iran, but it's a minor religion now. Maybe 100 to 200,000 people are still in that particular mode. All right, well, let's take a look at let's take a look at some of the kings. I thought I had the wrong slide up there. Let's take a look at some of the kings of the Persian Empire. As I said, it started in 550 with Cyrus. When he overcame the Babylonian Empire, he was the first king of that. We also know that that David served him. Daniel served him as well. Daniel was in Babylonian captivity, but when Cyrus took over as the Persian, Cyrus became the last king that Daniel served. So that's kind of an interesting biblical point right there. King Cambyses, we don't know much about him. About all we know about him, he wasn't king very long, maybe 6 or 7 years. What we do know about him is that he went and conquered Egypt, and he went and conquered parts of North Africa. And he had to come back because his nation was kind of under attack itself, and he had to come back from that. So otherwise, we don't know a whole lot about him. Now, King Darius, we know about him. He's spoken about in the Bible. King Darius provided some funding and encouragement for the rebuilding of the temple. We read about that in Scripture. King Xerxes is who Esther married. Now, Norman and I just got back from Branson and, let's see, what's it called? Sight and Sound Theater. And it was one of the very last showings, or performances, it wasn't a showing, performances of Esther. And it was fabulous. I mean, it was just really great. And so we loved that. We try to see, we've seen a lot of them. We haven't seen all of them, but they do a very good job doing that. But anyway, he was a Persian. He was the 4th Persian king. And then, of course, there came along Artaxerxes, and it was him that saw the completion of the city. Not that he personally oversaw it, but he was there during the time that the city of Jerusalem was reestablished, and Israel in a fashion was remade. Not totally, wasn't great, but it was kind of remade there. And that was also under the second return of Jewish people back to their homeland under Ezra. Won't get into that, but again, all of these except Cambyses was pretty much tied into biblical happenings. So Persian Empire and Israel had a lot of connection together. Now, do you know of any other Persian kings? Have you met any of them? Have you read about any of them? Well, here's one. Reza Pahlavi. What do we normally call him? The Shah of Iran, okay? He ruled from 1941 to 1979 in that same concept, in that same type of nationality. And so he was, of course, during the Islamic Revolution, he was deposed and fled or moved to Egypt to get away from the Islamic Revolution, and died the next year of lymphoma, which he had had the cancer for quite a while. So I just kind of thought that was interesting. The word Shah, by the way, means king. That's what that means. All right. So let's look at some significant Jewish events as well. 536, we've talked about that. That's the first return that was led by Zerubbabel of about 50,000 people. The temple foundation was laid, but some of the old men were not happy. Why were they not happy? Well, some of the old men, the old guys there, had seen the original temple. Many of the people that returned had never seen the temple, okay? But many of the old folks had seen it, and they just kind of put their hands up and said, man, this is terrible. This is nothing like the original temple. And so they got very discouraged. Work stopped on it, and instead they started building their own houses. Now God gets a little peeved at that, and we'll talk about that in just a second. In 520 BC, Haggai and Zechariah come and call the nation to rebuild. Get with it. Do the things that you need to do. 516, the temple was complete. 457 BC, Ezra led that second return under King Artaxerxes. Israel led a group of exiles back to Jerusalem and attempted a spiritual revival. They faced a lot of obstacles from the non-Jewish people, because when they had gone into captivity, a lot of non-Jewish people had come in and moved into the area. If there's a vacuum, it will be filled by something. And so when there was a vacuum, it was filled by folks, and they were not nice, and they discouraged the Jews as well. 445, Nehemiah rebuilt the walls. And 425, the city was complete once again. Got the city and the temple by 425. So it took a while. 536 to 425 is a long time, but it finally got done. Things didn't happen very rapidly back then. All right, let's look at the prophet Haggai himself. He was the first prophet to speak to the post-exile Jews. After they came back, he was the very first prophet to speak to them. He was likely an older man. If you look at chapter 2 and verse 3, he kind of hints at age, not necessarily his own, but we kind of think may be. He says, "Who of you is left who saw this house?" Talking about the temple. Who of you is left who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Does it not seem to look like nothing? Okay. Now, he starts the next verse a little more positive. But he may have been one that saw the original house. Most scholars that wrote about this believe that he actually did. His message was a message of assurance. If you look at the first chapter of Haggai in verse 13, then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave this message of the Lord to the people. He said, "I am with you, declares the Lord." So one of the first things that he did, and that wasn't the only thing from the Lord. There's more at the beginning of chapter 1. But that's one of those things where it's like, does God even care about us? We went off into captivity. We got to come back. We started to build things. It didn't work out. It was ugly. It wasn't the same thing. We're all discouraged. Where's God? Haggai shows up and said, God says, "I'm with you." Well, that should be encouraging to them. And it was, to a degree. and help them along, okay? So Jewish tradition says that Haggai was a priest. Bible doesn't say that. Jewish tradition says that, and says that he was a priest and of the great synagogue. And post-exile Judaism, the synagogue was called the Sanhedrin. Now, also remember that synagogue came from their captivity. When the Jews went into captivity in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar plundered the temple, took the temple things out, except, of course, for the ark. That went into a storage house in Washington. But, okay, I'm waiting. Okay. Anyway, Nebuchadnezzar plundered it and brought the items from the temple and gold and everything and did stuff with it. So when they went back, guess what? They didn't have all that. This is the point at which the Holy of Holy Places has no Ark of the Covenant. And if they have any of the trappings of the temple, they had to remake those as well. So anyway, this is where they got the tradition of the synagogue, because when the Jewish people went into captivity, into Babylon, they didn't have temple, all this kind of stuff, so they recreated a way to study and learn and worship, and that became synagogue. And so that's where synagogue came from. Synagogue was not a command or an instruction of God for them to do it. They just did it because they didn't have anything else. So today, if someone was to come along politically or whatever and tear all the church buildings down, God forbid, very convenient, but we would still have to do something. So we would probably meet in homes, or we'd gather someplace to do. We would improvise, because church buildings are also not a command of God. So what is a command of God is worship me, love me, obey my commands, all that kind of stuff. And so the Jews tried to do that in Babylon, and they did the best, I believe, that they could. All right, let's look at the book of Haggai. If you don't have it out already, you might open it. It's a very short book. It has 2 chapters, and they're not very long. And so we'll get into this in just a little bit. Now, Haggai has been described. I talked a little bit about it as a man with a single ambition. Of course, that was to complete the temple. Encourage folks to do that. He preached to the poor people. He preached to the discouraged people. He preached to the frightened people. He attributed their lack of success to the single fact that they hadn't built the temple. And so we're going to get into this. They didn't rebuild the temple. They came and got discouraged right off the bat, and they didn't build the temple. So what is God saying to the people? He's saying the first order is your worship, your dedication to me. I am God. I am the creator of everything. I am your Savior, as it were, in those days. And he wanted them to worship him. But they had neglected to rebuild the temple. So Haggai got after. Really, he and Zechariah both are credited with getting the temple completed in 5 years. It was completed by 516 BC. The difference between Haggai and Zechariah's approach was that Haggai rebuked and admonished the people, while we'll learn next week, Zechariah was more of an encourager to the people, and probably a younger man as well. So we get into the book itself. We want to date the book about 520 to 518 BC. Haggai chapter 1 and verse 1 says, "In the 2nd year of King Darius, on the 1st day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai." So since we do have historical records about the Persian Empire and all those kind of things, we can begin to date pretty easily. There's a lot of things in the Bible that's very difficult to date. We're kind of in an area right now that's not difficult to date. We know through historical records and through biblical records about when these things happened as well. Did I read all of that? On the second year of King Darius, on the first day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Okay, so we have a setting in the very first verse of the book of Haggai as to when and where we are in this. So let's look at the book. We're going to start in chapter 1, where God speaks to the people and things begin to happen. Now, he's going to speak through Haggai. So we're going to have a number of places where he does this. If you look at the first one that we just read, it says, it tells about the second year of Darius, but the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. So Haggai is speaking for God. In verses, and going on down into verse 2, this is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say, the time has not yet come for the Lord's house to be built. God knows what they're saying. God is telling Haggai this, okay? This is not the time, it hasn't come yet for the Lord's house to be built. Wrong. That's what they were thinking. God is not happy with this at all. So the first thing Haggai talks to them about is, hey, we know what you're saying. We know what your attitude is. We know what your actions are. And you don't think we need to be building the temple right now. Now, why did they do that? Because they had started and they had worked on the foundation and they gave up. Apparently, some of the older guys, as we mentioned earlier, look, they said, well, this is not going to be like the old one. So we're all discouraged. God is saying, you better get with it. You need to get with it. Okay? And look at verses 3 and 4. He says, is it time for you to have houses? What happened when they got discouraged about building the temple? They started building houses for themselves. Now, it seems strange that God would live in a house, okay? We know that God lived or dwelled in, a fiery pillar. We know he dwelt in the holy place of the tabernacle. We know that he dwelt in that's where they met God. That's where the high priest met God. That's where he was with his people. They needed a direction. They needed a thing. They needed something to know. And so he says, okay, this is where I'll build. God doesn't have to live in a house. We know that. But for them, it was the best thing. It was the best thing for them. So we look at verse 3 and 4. He says, then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. This is another time. Is it time for you yourselves to be living in paneled houses while this house remains ruined? You guys have got it made. You live in beautiful homes, and where's God's temple? It's called a house. Where's God's temple? So he's getting on to them, all right? Look in verse 5 and 6. Give careful thought to your ways, he says. Now, this is what the Lord said. Give careful thought to your ways. My dad used to use these terms. He would say, I want you to think about it. When he said that, I knew, okay, it's something I really need to put in my head because I'm not doing correctly, okay? God puts it in different words. He says, he says, give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much, but you have harvested little. You eat, but never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. You put on clothes, but you're not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse with holes in it. Aha, that's where that saying comes from. Your pockets must have holes in it, son, because I gave you money and you no longer have it. All right, same concept. Here we go. So, isn't it, God is speaking our language here. That's why we said Haggai is something that's easy to understand. He's speaking in words we can get, okay? There's something going on here. So he says again, look at verse 7 through 8. He's going to use those same words again. Again, he says, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. Now, first time he said that, give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much. He's talking about things aren't going well with you, okay? All the things you're doing are not succeeding. This time he says, give careful thought to your ways. Go up into the mountains and bring down timber and build the house so that I may take pleasure in it and be honored. Build the temple. It's, how God fits in with things on earth is amazing, because when I hear God saying this through Habakkuk, I can think of even like my own dad. If Dad said, go do this, get this done, and I would go wherever, and then Dad would come back and he'd say, okay, go get that tool, bring it over here, take that bolt off, move it, have to give specific instructions. So in 3 through 4, or in 5 through 6, he said he gave him a general thing to do and talked to him about it. In 7 through 8, he says, here's how you do it. How frustrated must God be with these folks? Go into the mountains and bring down the timber and build my house. And then he's going to tell them then about the things that he talked about up in verse 6. He says, you expect much, but see, it turned out to be little. What you brought home, I blew away. Why? Declares the Lord Almighty. Because of my house, which remains a ruin. While each of you is busy with his own house, therefore, my house is in ruin while you're each busy with your own house. I didn't say that correctly. Therefore, because of you, the heavens have withheld their due. In other words, I'm the one that caused this. If you didn't get enough crop, I caused it. And their due and for the earth and crops. I called for a drought on the fields and the mountains on the grain and the grain. And the new wine, the oil, and whatever the ground produces on men and cattle and on the labor of their hands. Guess why you're struggling so much? I caused it. You wondering why all this happened? I did it. Today, we have El Nino and La Nina, and everything seems to be centered around those two. Then God says, I'm going to withhold, he calls it the dew or the rain. I'm going to withhold that so you're not getting done the things you need to do. And so down in verse 12, then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and the whole remnant of the people obeyed the voice of the Lord their God and the message of the prophet Haggai, because the Lord their God had sent him, and the people feared the Lord. So God needed to speak to them. How do we remain in a positive state? How do we remain in a position in our lives where our lives reflect the will of God? How do we remain strong? How do we remain faithful to God today? And I would relate this today, and I would say we need to hear from God. And that may be why this church is pretty good about doing Bible study and things of that nature. We need to hear from God. You and I need to hear from God. And when we hear from God, we are encouraged. If we have not heard from God, we run amok, or we run our own way, or whatever the case may be. So, anyway, all right, let's go to chapter 2. Oh, boy. Okay, chapter 2, verses 1 through 9. We're going to divide this up just a little bit. Through Haggai and Zerubbabel, to Zerubbabel and Joshua in the first two verses. And he gives the dates again. I love the dates. On the 21st day of the 7th month, the work of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. I think this is a year and a half later. Speak to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah. He goes on, Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and to the remnant of the people. Ask them, who of you is left who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look now? Does it not seem like nothing? But now be strong. What they saw and they reacted to, God is saying to them exactly what they saw and reacted to. It's not what we thought it was going to be. So we end it in verse 4, the first part of verse 4, by saying, but now be strong, okay? O Zerubbabel, declares the Lord, be strong. O Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest, be strong, all of you people of the land. Declare the Lord and work. For I am with you, declares the Lord Almighty. This is what I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt, and my spirit remains with you. Do not fear. I don't know. I mean, I wasn't there. You and I weren't there. We don't get exactly what's going on. We know that when the people came out of, when Abraham's people came out of Egypt, we know that they got discouraged in the wilderness and thought maybe we ought to go back to Egypt, you know. Well, these folks come out of captivity, and they're not saying maybe we ought to go back to Babylon or back into the Persian Empire, but they kind of don't know what to do. They need God speaking to them, and he's doing a marvelous job doing so. Look at verse 6. This is what the Lord Almighty says, in a little while I will once again shake the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry land, and I will shake all the nations, and the desired that desired of the nations will come, and I will fill this house with glory, says the Lord Almighty. He's going to make things happen, and glory is going to come back. Look at verse 8. The silver is mine, the gold is mine, declares the Lord. The glory of the present house will be greater than the glory of the former house. They needed to hear that. And in this place I will grant peace, declares the Lord Almighty. Peace is a big word in Judaism. You know what the word is. It's shalom. We even hear it today, shalom. We say, well, shalom means peace. It does, but it also means completeness. It also means soundness, okay? It also means welfare. Things will go well. So peace is what they need. Peace is what we need today. Peace is what they needed then as well. Because of their rebellion against God, they went into captivity. So now that they came back, they didn't find things any better here than they did in captivity. So they're a little bit down and discouraged. So God's saying, okay, I got this. I'm going to bring peace. And then at the very end of chapter 2, or close to the end of chapter 2, he brings a blessing on these defiled people. He says in verse 10, he says, we got the same dates. On the 24th of the day of the month, in the second year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Haggai. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Ask the priests what the law says. If a person carries a consecrated meat in the fold of a garment, and that fold touches some bread or stew or wine or oil or other food, does it become contaminated? And the priest said, no. The priests God's getting ready to use the law toward them, okay? So then Haggai said, if a person is defiled by contact with a dead body, touches one of these things, does it become defiled? Yes. The priest said, they got it in becoming defiled. Verse 14, then Haggai said, so it is with this people and this nation in my sight, declares the Lord. Whatever they do and whatever they offer there is defiled. Because of their rebellion, whatever they offered to God is defiled. We're going to rebuild the temple, and then your sacrifices will be accepted. Before, they're not going to be accepted. All right, look at, we're done. We're out of time. So anyway, next week we'll get into Zechariah, and go ahead and read it. It's a bunch of chapters. They're not big chapters, but it's a bunch of chapters. Go ahead and read it, and you'll help me out as well. God bless.